All right, well, let's start in prayer. Father, we thank you for this opportunity to spend time in your word and to do it with loved ones. And um, what a wonderful blessing it is that you've given us your word and your teachings um, for our purpose, that we might grow in understanding and then grow closer to you. But Father, we're approaching Easter and spring, and things are getting warmer, and we're reminded of the renewal um, that is found in you, the renewal that of Christ's resurrection and rebirth and of life everlasting, and we celebrate the fact that you show us that you can bring life from what appears to be dead every spring. So as things progress and it gets nicer, help us to remember that it is an image of rebirth that you're showing us, and help us truly look forward and prepare our hearts for that um, Easter celebration, that we might really appreciate all that you've done for us in Jesus. And we ask, Father, you would bless this time together as we study your word, again, looking for renewal in our souls. And it's in Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. All right, well, we had started in chapter 32 last time. And you remember, Jacob is essentially the patriarch that right now the Bible is really focusing on, although Isaac is still alive in the land. And Jacob's been told to head back to Israel, so he's going back. And we know that he's going to be God's representative. And when he gets there, and as he's returning to the promised land, and that God is working to mature Jacob and to mature, his walk with him, so that he can be this acceptable representative. And what did Jacob do just in the last chapter? In terms of leaving the land behind. Who else did he leave behind?
Well, his father-in-law.
Right, his father-in-law Laban, who was pretty evil and deceitful to him, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so he's left that, and who did he run into as soon as he got, into the promised land? Do you remember?
His brother Esau.
Well, before that, all these angels, right?
Yeah.
Remember, just like when he had left, there were angels and a vision from God, and now as he returns, he runs into angels. He sees angels in a camp, and as he's getting ready to enter the promised land, he's got to deal with the fact that his brother Esau is still there, and Esau was threatening to kill him before he left. So he sends messengers to let him know that he's back in the land, and they come back and tell him what?
He's got 400 men coming with him to meet you.
Yeah, Esau's coming with 400 men. And of course Jacob immediately thinks about and reflects on, and can't blame him, the fact that Esau was threatening to kill him, and that's why he had to leave 20 years ago, right? And what did Jacob do after that? Do you remember?
After he left 20 years ago, or after he heard about the brothers coming?
After he hears about Jacob, Esau's coming to him.
He lines up his stuff. He's going to divide up, send some one way, send another way, and he's given a huge gift. And he instructs one person to say, who do you work, whatever.
Yeah.
And here's all this stuff. He's giving him a ton of stuff.
Yeah, he's going to send abeyance and gifts, and he's breaking his camp up. Remember, he broke his camp up in two.
Right. And some survive. Like send one way, send the other.
That's right. If he attacks one, then the other one will survive. Which kind of gives you an idea of just how big his camp is, because The implication there is, I guess, is that, Esau couldn't divide his 400 men up and take out both of them, or something to that effect. Now there was something in between those two things about getting the gifts ready and breaking the camp into two and stuff like that Jacob did. Do you remember what that was?
He prayed, but he didn't say my God. He said God of my father.
That's right. And it's his first prayer that's recorded for us, so it's a kind of a big deal. And it implies we were thinking, Jacob is starting to change, and yet he's certainly not, all the way in terms of trusting God because of what he's doing. And we talked about the fact that the gifts and everything else, he's really trying to deceive, connive, manipulate Esau, and that type of thing. I mean, what would have been a different way for Jacob to deal with this? I mean, there's a whole bunch of them.
Well, he could ask God to go.
Yeah, and he did do that, but then after the prayer, what could he have done? Well, I mean, why send all these gifts and everything else? Why doesn't he take something if he wants to and go?
So he's not believing God because God has said, he'll let him prosper and take care of him. So he can go meet him face to face and say,
that's right. I was wrong.
God is going to take care of him no matter what.
Yeah, and he could go and he could tell him, hey, look, I was wrong and stuff like that. And yet he's going through these other things about sending all of this stuff. When I read through this, I always come back to the same point of remembering or thinking, it's almost like Jacob considers God and God's promises as a backup plan. That's plan B. If the presents don't make Esau feel better and don't stop the problems, well, then there's always God. And that's actually kind of human nature. I mean, we do that all the time. We get into a mess of some type and we try to solve it on our own, and then we remember to pray and God will take care of it, and then we go back to trying to fix it ourselves. And so in Jacob we see him doing really the same thing. So he sent these 500 animals, he split up his camp, he's getting prepared, and all of those kinds of things. And we also talked about the fact that don't miss the fact that God didn't hesitate to let Jacob get kind of, if you will, pinched between Laban behind him and Jacob in front of, and Esau in front of him. I mean, now Laban has apparently turned around and gone back. As I said last time, if I was Jacob, I'm not so sure how much I'd really trust that. Okay. But, so he is somewhat worried about Laban, and he's just worked through that. Now he's got this other immediate threat right in front of him, which is Esau coming. And I think that you have to think about the fact that, but in between that, he sees God's angels. And yet he still goes back to worrying and to panicking, right? And so we talked a little bit about, well, why would God let that happen? And we talked about, he's using this to grow Jacob. Okay, and we can't miss that or forget that. Well, in verse 20, we're just going to pick up real quickly there. And Jacob's instructing servants, and he said, you shall say, behold, your servant Jacob also is behind us, for he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me. Then afterward I will see his face, and perhaps he will accept me. And so there, Jacob's real plan is he's going to appease, he's going to throw enough gifts at, Esau, it's really not about trusting in God. You know, I mean, he's. It seems like he wants to a little bit, but he's just really not getting there. You know, and as I said, you know, there's no indication of it that he plans to acknowledge that he was wrong, to seek forgiveness, you know, that type of thing. So his motive just really isn't really quite right. So again, you know, is Jacob really trusting in God, and is he not? And you know, I don't, like I say, I don't know about you, but particularly early in my walk, and still at times today, still, you know, I'll pray and I'll give a situation and a problem to God, and then I turn around and I try to manage it myself. You know, almost like I'm taking the problem back from God. I'm not letting him do what he has to do. And it's a fine line to understand, where am I partnering with God, and where am I not letting God do his thing? You see, if I want to manage it and solve the problem completely on my own, God's going to let me do that. Well, okay, Eric, if you'd rather do it your way, that's fine. You know, you can wait on me, you can trust me, and you can let me do it, and you know, I've got the best plan, and I can do things beyond your imagination. But hey, if you'd rather do it, knock yourself out. You know, and that happens a lot. And you know, it's so easy to get down on Jacob, but I mean, I think it's important to see it from that perspective. Okay.
Because I was just going to say, you know, I mean, God tells us to take action too. You know?
That's right.
And it's like, okay, God, I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to sit here and just wait for you to do something. You know, but you know, at what point, at what time do we, you know, grease the skids, you know, and be working with God versus sitting on our fanny doing nothing. So yeah, I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's the key. You know, how much do we do, and how much do we do in accordance with God's will?
Yeah.
And where does faith play? And it takes time to learn those things. And I really do believe that that's one of the messages in this story, is learning how to do that, or that at least we have to do that. Does that make sense to you, Maya?
Yes.
Okay. And of course, you know, we skipped over a little bit, talked about it briefly. You know, all of these things and this lack of full trust is playing out immediately after Jacob has seen God's direct intervention in helping him with Laban. He helped him with the dream, and he warned Laban not to touch Jacob, and so, you know, Jacob understood that, but he just doesn't quite put all the puzzle pieces yet together. All right, well, why don't we start reading in verse 22. Let's read 22. Well, let's just read 22 through 23, okay? Maya, will you read that?
That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions.
Okay, so these are his final possessions. His final preparations. So, you know, it's a late night. I mean, and it's a long day. He was up with Laban the morning before, working through all of the details to get to essentially a truce. Okay, and then he went on his way, continued apparently, and saw the camp of the angels. And now it's night, and you know, he's making the final preparations. He's taking the wives and the maids across, and all the children across the river, and he sends them over there. And he now everything he's got is on the west side of this river, and he's going to go back to the east side. I don't know if he's just going, but we talked briefly about this last time. I don't know if he goes back to spend some time alone just for peacefulness and for prayer, or if he's checking to make sure every last goat is over, or whatever it is that he's doing. But he ends up back there by himself. Sorry, I got 2 pages sticking together. Okay, so Marie, will you read verses, let's say 24 through 27, please?
Okay. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint, as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" He said, "Jacob."
How about 28? I'll just read through the rest of the chapter.
Okay. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place
Peniel.
Peniel,
Peniel, yeah.
"It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him, and he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, of this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon.
Okay, so Jacob goes back over by himself, and then we've got this verse 24, which really, when you think about it, is just such a weird verse. Okay, then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. So what are some of the things that seem so weird about that?
All of it.
Okay, well, be specific. I don't disagree with you, but bring out a couple of points.
Well, who is this man, and why are they wrestling? And why did they wrestle for so long?
And where does he come from?
Yeah.
I mean, he just had this huge company. All day long he's been splitting stuff up, and the group and the gifts and everything else, and now he's taken, and it tells us right there he was left alone. So where does this? It's like this guy just pops in, and they start to wrestle, and they wrestle the rest of the night. Now, a couple of things to think about, which is, and we'll come back to this. This is not an allegory. Okay, this is two guys rolling around in the dirt and the rocks. Probably trying not to roll into the stream. I mean, they're out there wrestling, okay? And notice it says a man wrestled with him. Jacob doesn't start to wrestle with this guy. This guy starts to wrestle with him. I mean, and it makes sense, right? I mean, the last thing Jacob needs after having a fight with his father-in-law that could have cost him his life, and having gotten out of that, and now worried about Esau coming with 400 men, do you really think Jacob wants to fight with anybody else?
No.
No, I wouldn't, right? And so, it says here that Jacob's in this camp alone. Well, sort of, okay? It's not the other way around. It's not like somebody came into the camp and Jacob says, "What are you doing in my camp?" and starts to wrestle with him. The guy comes there and starts to wrestle with him. Okay.
See, what I don't understand is, this is, God could just squash him like a bug. That's why I wonder the wrestled was literal or not. Or...
No, it's literal.
Okay.
It's literal, and we know that for a fact because of the hip. Okay. So we go on in verse 25. Notice what it says. And when he saw that he had not prevailed against him. Now this is one of those things in life. It's just my pet peeve. You find it in the Bible periodically. In life, it just drives me crazy. I hate pronouns. I just hate them because a kid comes to me or somebody comes to me and telling me he, him, him. Well, who? Who? All right, and this is one of those sections that for me, maybe you're different, but for me, I have to stop and think, okay, who's he and who's him, and and so anyhow, when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he being the man had not prevailed against Jacob. Okay.
Mine says when the man saw that he could not overpower him,
Yep.
touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so it wasn't quite as confusing.
And
mine has capital He and
yeah,
and not
and not all do, but that's probably good. That's probably a better way to have it. Okay. Now don't forget that when Jacob gets to this place and stops, or maybe, and it's not really clear to me. Maybe Laban leaves and Jacob doesn't actually move. Maybe Jacob just sees the angels then. But wherever, the first thing he saw there was angels. And don't forget that when he was leaving, he saw the angels in a dream, and God, remember, talked to him. And the way the Hebrew was written was God was, probably right there beside Jacob. So if he sees the angels coming back, is it unreasonable to expect that he would see God again? Of course, it would explain why the man would come out of nowhere, doesn't it? Now, the word prevailed that most translations have kind of gives maybe the wrong impression. As in, this guy who's 97 years old is holding his own in this wrestling match. That's not really the meaning or the intent here, and you'll see it as we go on. So don't think it's as if the man wrestling with Jacob couldn't prevail. It's just that he hadn't. Okay. And so then he reaches out, he touches the socket of Jacob's thigh, so that the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. All right, well, the obvious question and answer is, who can just touch a person's hip and dislocate it?
I would guess God.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a normal man, right? And yet when he's described as a man, the clear indication here is that this is God, and yet God looks like a man. So when did God look like a man? Jesus. Now a lot of people don't like to think this through because they struggle with it, and I understand that. But this is probably another yet Christophany. And we've seen them before. It was pretty clear when the two angels show up at Abraham's camp and start to talk to him about, hey, you're going to have a kid in the spring or whatever it is. And, oh, by the way, let's go talk about what I'm going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. It was very clear from that language that one of them was God. And of course, God walked with, we read in chapter 2 or 3, 2 I guess it is, that God had the habit of walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening in the Garden of Eden. And we had talked then about, well, was it like truly God or just his spirit or his presence or what? And we talked about the fact that there are a number of places in the Old Testament, primarily in Genesis, but others as well, where we get this impression that God shows up in a pre-incarnate form of Jesus Christ. Okay, because it's the only thing that really makes sense here. Okay, as hard as it is maybe to understand, what that really tells us is that, Jesus has, before he was born in Bethlehem, had been on this earth multiple times, directly interacting with people. Okay, and so when people tell you, hey, God is just removed, if he does exist, he just wound up the universe and disappeared, that's clearly not the case. Nor is it the case that people had to wait, gazillions of years or 10,000 years or 8,000 years or 4,000 years, whatever it may happen to be, to get to Bethlehem and Jesus' birth. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's probably something here that's important to see. Now, when we talk about this, we read about in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5 through 6, and you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son he receives. And so we have this image here of Jacob wrestling with Jesus all night long, literally rolling around in the dirt, and it goes on to the morning light, to the point where Jesus reaches out and touches, I guess I should say God, reaches out and touches the socket of Jacob's thigh so that it's dislocated.
Why does he want to dislocate his thigh?
Well, we'll see. So he's wrestling with God, and I want to point out also the timing of this. We started, one of the things I mentioned before we started reading, just as kind of a summary, was that God doesn't stop Jacob from getting himself into kind of a bind. I mean, why was Jacob in this bind in the first place? Well, he'd had problems and a difficult relationship with Laban, and in the end he sneaks out and deceives him by just leaving. He didn't leave properly. And then there's the whole thing with Rachel taking the idols, and so Laban follows. And of course, Jacob is coming towards him. Esau is coming towards Jacob, and Jacob's worried about it. Why? Well, because he deceived his brother Esau before he left, and he essentially, from a human point of view, appeared to steal the blessing and the birthright from him, although God had promised it to him. So you can't really steal what's already yours. But it felt that way to both Isaac and to Esau. So Jacob really put himself in this situation by his actions, and God lets him deal with it. Okay, but beyond that, think about what this is saying. You see, what we have here is a picture of God letting Jacob get to what kind of point in his life?
Between a rock and a hard place.
A rock and a hard place is a great way to put it. Or maybe sometimes it's thought of as the bottom, the pits. He's got nowhere else to go. He's trying to manipulate the situation yet again with the gifts and everything else. Okay, but he really is out of options here. And he's in a bad place if Esau's really approaching with 400 men ready to kill him. God waited till Jacob was in that place. And we see this in life all the time. God will wait till the time is right to deal with us. Okay. Now, there's a couple other messages here. You notice how the verse 24 started was Jacob was left alone. No, he wasn't. From a physical, worldly viewpoint, he's alone. But one of the comforting points here is, yet he really wasn't. We're never really alone. Okay? The other thing, is, again, if you come back to the big picture here, he's in this position where he's between a rock and a hard place, and yet he is alone in terms of his whole family is gone, all of the wives are gone, all of the servants are gone. Maybe there's a servant or two he trusts for advice, or they're all gone, and God chooses to work on Jacob in that situation. Now, for me, this is just one of those places in Scripture that is just so meaningful, because here's the summation of it, right? God waited till Jacob was petrified, scared. He's running. He's dealt with problem after problem. He's seen God work and preserve him and help him and support him, but he doesn't trust in God, and he's still trying to do it on his own. He's in a really bad place, and then when he's really completely by himself, God wrestles with him. You ever wrestled with God? I have. And occasionally I still do. And it's not fun. It feels like you're in the dirt, rolling in the rocks, in the pits, in a wrestling match. I mean, this is such a relevant picture to periods in my life. I remember, I don't know, Maya, if you ever went through anything like this, or Marie, but I remember when I was in high school and a kid, and I had so much anxiety and so much crap built up inside of me, and I was just beside myself, and I would think to myself, it feels like I'm wrestling with demons today. And it's just like in the cartoons. While it doesn't happen like that, it does feel like just in the cartoons where you've got the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder.
Yeah.
And you are wrestling. And that is what Jacob is going through here. He is wrestling with God. Okay?
And at some point he realizes it is God, because he asked him for a blessing. I mean, you wouldn't ask for a blessing from just a man, right?
It's interesting. I wonder, I don't really know. I suspect it was near the end, but I don't really know. When did Jacob realize that it was God? I don't know.
He didn't want to let go.
But
he insisted on a blessing.
But notice, now read it, let's go back and read it very carefully. Verse 25. When he saw that he had not prevailed against the man touched the socket of the thigh, so that the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he was wrestling with him. Then he said, the man said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But he said, that's Jacob, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Jacob has figured out that this guy he's wrestling with can bless him. He knows at this point. Why? Well, maybe because all he did was touch his socket, and now his socket's out of joint. How easy is it to wrestle when your socket's out of joint?
Not very.
How's he doing that? See, what's happening here is this match changes from Jacob wrestling with God to Jacob clinging to God, begging for a blessing.
So he submits.
Oh, what did you say?
He submits to God.
He submits to God. The prevail is that he wouldn't submit to God all night long. Now, doesn't that fit with what your personal experiences of wrestling with God? I wrestle with God because I just refuse to give in. I won't submit. And so this idea here is he's wrestled all night. Esau's coming. He's got a big day ahead of him. It's not like God's afraid of the daylight. God says, look, it's time for you to get ready. ready for your next day. And he touches him at the thigh and says, this has got to end. And Jacob now submits and says, bless me. He's no longer trying to prevail against God. Now he's clinging to him, saying, bless me. Do you see the change in Jacob's nature here?
Yes.
And this is such a perfect picture of what every single person has to go through. And that's why I read Hebrews chapter 12 verses 5 through 6. Everyone is disciplined. Every son that the Lord loves, every one that he loves, he disciplines and scourges.
I'm sorry, Hebrews
12 verses 5 through 6. I read it a couple minutes ago.
Yep.
Okay. And so God gives him a literal physical ailment. Okay. So that Jacob would be dependent on God. We read in the Bible, in the scriptures, that God uses the things that are foolish of man. And when we read about Paul, the Apostle Paul's history, he says, hey, I had a thorn in my side and I prayed 3 times for God to remove it. And God said, no, my grace is sufficient. See, he's doing the same thing to Jacob. What Jacob needs is to trust and rely on God. It's the one thing Jacob needs. And so God says, okay, I'll put you in a place where you have no choice. You'll become dependent on me. What did Jacob do when he first got up to Paddan-aram and he's trying to impress Rachel? He moves the big stone all by himself. You think he's going to do it now with a hip out of joint?
Yeah. Or fight his brother.
Or fight his brother. Verse 26, then he said, let me go, for dawn is breaking. But he says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So, like I said, Jacob is clinging to him. Okay. He's determined now to get a blessing. Now, isn't it interesting that he was determined before to get a blessing from whom?
Oh, from Esau, I guess.
From Isaac. Remember his father, remember?
Yeah, okay.
And how did he go about doing it?
He was deceitful.
He can't deceive God. How do we know that? Verse 27. So he said to him, what is your name? The man says to Jacob, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Now that is so revealing.
Okay.
What does the name Jacob mean? Do you remember?
Deceiver.
Deceiver. Grabber. Heel grabber. Right? What is God forcing him to do?
Tell him who he is. And, unlike when he was with Isaac, he kept saying he was Esau. So he's admitting the truth.
He's admitting that he's confessing.
Okay.
He's a deceiver. He's a conniver, and he's a manipulator. That's what's all summarized in his name. And remember how many times we've talked about a name represents a person's nature. What Jacob is forced to do is acknowledge, this is my name, this is who I am. I'm a manipulator, I'm a deceiver, I'm a liar. And isn't it interesting that's what God asked him? What is your name? And he says, that's who I am. He was forced to confess who he was. Verse 28, he said to him, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. Now, my translation has it, and I think, Maya, you read this part, and it was very similar to yours. For you have striven with God and with man and prevailed. Okay? the name really probably is better to think about it in the context. And many people are in different camps like this. My view is I think the name is better a reflection of God has striven with you. And the Hebrew can be interpreted either way. It can be interpreted, he who strives with God or God strives. But really the idea here in the context here is God has striven with Jacob. And Jacob has finally submitted. God wouldn't let him go. Okay? Now, as we think about these things and we go through this, one of the other things that is really important, even though it might be hard to imagine or visualize, okay, is how intimate wrestling really is. I mean, this is not something like they're standing 30 feet away from each other and throwing rocks at each other or something like that. Or across the room screaming at each other or arguing or having a discussion or something. I mean, they are intimate and personal and wrestling, right up next to each other. Okay? And so this is an intimate thing that we see happening. Okay? And as I say, isn't it interesting, that there's this blessing here, and God asks him, "What's your name?" And he has to admit that it's Jacob. And he says, so it's no longer going to be conniver or cheater or manipulator or deceiver, but it's going to be God strives with you. Okay. And he says, it'll be Israel. God strives with you, for you have striven with God and with man, and have prevailed. Again, with this idea, he prevailed by submitting. So God is essentially telling Jacob, as well as us, no, you're not a deceiver anymore. You're the one who's striven with God, but God would not let you go. And that's that now, if we think about that in terms of the line of the patriarchs, we see God calling Abraham into the land, God, working in the life of Isaac, and Isaac being a man of prayer, Abraham being the man of faith that he was. And here's this image now of God would not let Jacob go, who was a deceiver, until he was willing to start to submit to God's ways. And if God had to let him get into a bad situation, which he created himself, because God could have stepped in at any time and let Jacob know, hey, I'm going to protect you from Esau, I'm going to protect you from Laban. He simply said, I'll take you back safely, and lets Jacob decide, well, is God really with me or not?
So is Jacob born again, or?
Well, I think that's a great question. Okay. When God changes his name here, is he really changing his name?
I think he's changing his nature.
I think that's what the representation is.
Isn't that what happens to
that
us?
Jacob has finally changed and has accepted God,
Yeah.
and will follow him now and trust in him.
So Jacob says in verse 26, hey, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. And God's response is to change his name. That's the blessing. And if it's just a name, well, what kind of a blessing is that? It's his nature.
Well, are we new creations in Christ, and new?
Mm-hmm.
The old is out, and we're new, and.
So in Revelation chapter 2, verse 17, we read, and if you remember, we went through this quite a bit, okay, at the time. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, to him I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone, and a new name written on the stone, which no one knows but he who receives it. And in Ephesians 4, verse 24, we read, and put on a new self, which is the likeness of God, which has been created in the righteousness and the holiness of truth. And don't forget, God's already changed Abram's name to Abraham. And then Jesus had this habit of changing people's names too, didn't he?
Yeah. Simon to Peter.
That's right. Simon to
Saul
Peter,
to Paul.
Saul to Paul. Okay. And as we just read in Revelation, everyone who overcomes gets a new name. The idea here isn't that Jacob or we win in a struggle with God. Jacob overcame and prevailed his own nature by giving in, submitting, and clinging to God. That's when we prevail. See, God struggles with all of us and won't let us go. How do we win when we wrestle with God? Simply by acknowledging who we are and then clinging to God for blessing. Knowing it's His blessing that we need, that we can't do this in our own strength. Okay? Jacob wins when he's crippled and he stops struggling with God, stops trying to overcome God, and instead just wants to be blessed and cling to Him. Now, while I said this is a real physical wrestling match, it is, but it's more than that as well. There's the clear idea that there's the spiritual wrestling embodied in this that's going on. Okay, it is a true physical wrestling match, but it represents the wrestling of Jacob's spirit with God. Okay, it's a spiritual reality. You have to spiritually yield to God in your life, and it wasn't Jacob's nature to do that. If God hadn't put him into this situation, in a worst possible place, and then alone, he wouldn't have gotten here. You know, there's a message here, which is every now and again, make sure you're in a place where you're alone with God, particularly when you're having a hard time, because God may want to wrestle with you.
Do you mean like set aside quiet time for meditation and talking to Him?
Yeah.
Okay.
And let Him work through you. Okay? Give God that time to wrestle with you. Okay? And we think of it in terms of, you know, here, well, okay, see, Jacob's nature's been changed. Yet what we're going to see through the rest of the book of Genesis, for most of it, is that there will be times where Jacob is referred to as Jacob, and there'll be times when he's referred to as Israel.
Is that because he reverts back to some of his own ways?
Exactly. Don't you?
Oh, of course.
Of course. And then every now and again, when you revert back, God has to take you back to the woodshed. So it's not just a one time. Yeah, there's a one first time where you submit to Jesus and you accept Him as your Lord and Savior. But then at times in your life when your flesh takes over, you once again have to submit to Him, and it might be a struggle. Now, the interesting thing about Jacob here is this wrestling with God, as we've kind of hinted to so far, is not just a one-time thing. He's going to do it periodically, but it really represents what? Jacob's whole life. He doesn't know it. We can, as a reader now, look back in hindsight and say, he's been wrestling with God all his life. What did God say right before he was born to his mother Rebekah? Hey, he's wrestling with his brother in your womb. And yet the younger is going to, be in charge. The older will serve the younger. And rather than giving in and letting God just do that, he's been wrestling with God all of these years. And he's probably, remember Martin Luther estimated he was like 77 when he left. So he's like 97 years old now. He's still wrestling with God. Makes you wonder how things would have happened, how things would have gone had he quit wrestling with God years ago and just given in. I wonder about that in my own life all the time. So give time to God where he can, wrestle with you. Make sure you have that time alone with him. Let him do that. Okay? So we see that this isn't just a representation of this event. It's Jacob's life. But many people have also pointed out, but look at the entire history of the nation of Israel. See, his name gets changed to Israel. Jacob represents the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel's history all through the Old Testament is wrestling with God. Sometimes they do okay, and then the next generation comes in and they wrestle with God all over again, and maybe they don't do so good. Okay, their whole history is a history of wrestling with God, and then Jesus comes along, and what do? They, as a nation, they demand that the Romans crucify him. They're wrestling with God, and they think they're winning, but they're losing. Look at the nation of Israel today. They think that they're doing okay. They're in the promised land. They're economically doing fairly well. They've got a military that's fairly good. God's protecting them. But they're really, if you think about it, they're still wrestling with God, because it's a very secular nation, and they haven't accepted Jesus as Messiah yet. This is the first use of the name of Israel. Remember, some time back we talked about the fact that when a key word is used for the first time, it typically has very important and special significance. And this is the situation that God chooses to rename Israel. And I think it's clear that is exactly what he's signifying. That all of Israel's history is going to be a wrestling match, a struggle with God. But I don't think it's just to pick on Israel that the Jewish people struggle with God. I think they represent all of us. This is a representation of mankind. We all wrestle with God. And sometimes, regrettably, people don't submit. They just keep on wrestling. Also, think about this. Sometimes the divine touch of God on our lives doesn't represent or result in something special like blessing or authority or money or maybe sometimes it actually is what it results from it is a wound or a limp. Now, Jewish writings indicate that Jacob limped the rest of his life on this leg. This was not a temporary thing. It was dislocated. Okay, there was a permanent problem here. Now, whether he tried to do something about it, what about doctors, whatever it is, the indication is that he limps on this for the whole rest of his life. It is a permanent reminder of his dependence, his need to be dependent on God, and his need to submit to God. Now, verse 20.
It hurt? Do you think God wanted him to hurt for the rest of his life?
I'm not so sure that it hurt. Maybe it did at times.
Okay.
Okay? But God wants him to remember, hey, you're dependent on me. And so he makes him dependent on God. See, sometimes God in our lives doesn't give us exactly what we want. He gives us what we need. Okay, and he makes us dependent on it. But we have to come to that point where we're willing to quit struggling with him and give in. So we read on. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men. Of course, he has truly done that, and he's prevailed. He prevailed by giving in. Verse 29, then Jacob asked and said, tell me your name. Why does Jacob want to know his name?
I don't know, because doesn't he realize it? He realizes it's God.
He realizes it's God.
Moses asked, he told him I am.
Moses
Is it
asked.
because he's trying to gain, like, have some semblance of I'm in charge, you tell me who you are?
I think so.
It's the one last attempt of, well, who the hell are you?
I think it, if not that, it's to try to make himself an equal, a name on a first name basis kind of a thing. It's not entirely clear to me, but I think that's what it is. And notice God's response. Why is it that you ask me my name? Ask my name. And he blessed him right there. And so Jacob named the place Peniel, for I've seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. So he knows it's God, and the implication is God blesses him and leaves. He's just gone. I think, don't know, pray on it, meditate on it. I think God's answer to Jacob is, hey, look, first of all, I'm not answerable to you or anybody else. I'm above and beyond you, okay? You can know me as God, okay? And it's not until Jesus is incarnate at Bethlehem and goes through his ministry that we know him as Jesus. Now, Peniel means face of God or facing God. And again, it kind of goes back to this idea of how intimate this wrestling has been. Okay? And when you're wrestling with God, you may not realize it's God you're wrestling with at first, but it is very personal. It can be incredibly emotional. It can take over everything in your life or be the commanding thing in your life for a period of time until you get through this. Okay? Now in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, we read, he, that is referring to Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. He's the image of the invisible God. Well, again, who else could this really be? And he goes on to say, hey, I named this place Peniel. I've seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved. Verse 31, now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping on his thigh. Therefore, to this day, the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is in the socket of the thighs, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh and the sinew of the hip. And that kind of sounds a little strange. But what it really is saying is, historically, the Jews chose not to eat the meat from that part of the socket on an animal in order to remember the fact that Jacob had to be made dependent upon God. Okay? And it's the imagery of the event. And so they tried to invoke this into one of their aspects of their lives so that they would remember they need to be dependent on God. Now, it didn't always work that way. Okay?
I wondered if he had asked God his name so that he could, like build a temple to the God, blah, blah, blah.
I'm guessing not, because
Okay.
he doesn't have a habit of doing that.
Okay.
But I don't know. I mean, like I said, we're not really told. We do have to look at it a little bit. And I do think it's a little bit of his nature still struggling in there. And it's a hint to us that while his nature has changed, he is still going to continue to struggle with his flesh.
Yeah.
And that's what Romans chapter 7 and 8 are all about. You know, Paul says, hey, well, I'm a new creation, but when I try to conquer and overcome in my own power, I fail. You know, woe, what a terrible, person I am. I can't overcome. And in chapter 8 of Romans, the whole realization is, but in God, when I rely on the power of God, I can. And I think it's just a little hint here that while his nature is changed, he's still a fallen fleshly person, just like us. Okay? So we notice that God has blessed Jacob when? After a special trial in time of testing. When? After a period of struggling with God. See, God let Jacob come to the point where he realized that this wasn't going to work without God. Not only that, it's after a time of intense pleading with God. Okay? And we read that elsewhere in the scriptures, and I failed to write down the reference and stuff like that. When did this happen? After all of these things and after seeing God face to face and then surrendering to God. And isn't that the way it kind of works? We go through a trial, we struggle, we intently plead with God, and then once we finally see God for who he is, we surrender to God. Here we see a new Jacob. He has a new nature. He has been born again. Okay, essentially. Jacob is slowly beginning to understand the real meaning of the covenant and God's covenantal love and blessings. See, Jacob had thought it's all about having this power, having these riches, having this great relationship, being in charge. And why not? His grandfather was this great mighty sheik that everybody represented and knew, he walked with God. And they said the same thing about Isaac, remember, with the wells and everything else. And Abimelech comes to him and says, hey, we know you walk with God, and all these kinds of things. And that's what Jacob is thinking it's all about. And yet the truth is, the covenant relationship is about one who obeys God and submits to God. Now, the reason this story is so intimate and so personal is because without seeing it played out like this, it's so hard to imagine what God really wants to do. Okay? That he loves us so much that he's not going to let go of us. He's willing to continue to wrestle with us technically all the way to daybreak. And if he has to, he'll even injure us. And he'll do it for our own sake. Jacob becomes a man of faith after this, and while he does slip back to his old nature, his old ways, many times, he literally is now a new man. Okay? And as I said, we'll notice at times when he's referred to as Jacob versus Israel moving forward. Okay, Romans 8, chapter 5, we read, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set the things of the Spirit on their mind. Okay? And that's what Jacob is having to learn to do. And then a few verses later in 7 and 8 in Romans chapter 8, Paul also wrote, because the mind set on the flesh is hostile towards God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God, for it's not even able to do so. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Paul writes about those who are carnal or fleshly in their that's what it means in the translation. And what it really means is a person who's characterized in their nature by being very fleshly. And believers can be that way. That's what Paul tells us. You can be saved, but really be characterized by living in the flesh, okay, rather than continuing to submit daily to God. Jacob's permanent limp is a reminder that every step of his way for the rest of his life, he is dependent on God. Now, here's the real kicker. Jacob tries to manipulate things. He tries to break his camp up into two to preserve at least half of what he's got. Then he says, hey, maybe I can send him all kinds of gifts and I don't have to do this. And in between there, he prayed. He prayed for help with Esau. While I don't think he yet really realizes it, don't miss the point that this wrestling match is God's answer to his prayer. God making him dependent on him is the answer to Jacob's prayer. And as we move into the next chapter next time, what we see is by being injured, by now having this limp, by having been and seen God face to face and submitted to him, now Jacob is prepared. Okay. Any last comments or thoughts or questions?
Yeah, that's really good. Thanks.
Marie?
No, I was just gonna, I learned a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot there to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, it didn't make any sense, and now it's pretty outstanding. Thank you.
Pretty outstanding.
Yeah, when you first read that, you're like, okay, so he had a wrestling match with God, but I didn't understand it.
And you know, it is so easy to read about it and say, yeah, Jacob has this really strange wrestling match with a man who actually turns out to be God. And what has that got to do with anything?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a really significant thing. Jacob has run and manipulated all his life till he gets to a point where even he realizes. And isn't it interesting that his first recorded prayer is at this point in time? He cries out to God for help with Esau, and God shows up. And I tell people this all the time. In fact, I told the guys at my Thursday night class just this week, you know, sometimes the best thing you can do is just get to a place where you're all by yourself and literally cry out to God. Okay, I don't care if it means going outside and screaming. I don't care if it means of doing it inside. I recommend you be respectful. But God understands. And sometimes you just have to get down on your knees and cry out, scream out to God. I've actually done that in my life 3 different times.
I know one time that I did it.
And I will tell you, it worked so quickly. I was shocked by how fast. In fact, I walked away from that thinking, gee, why don't I do this more often? Why do I keep struggling to try to fix things and make it work myself? Why don't I just get down on my knees and cry out to God quicker? And here it is. Here's the picture of Jacob. It's an incredible lesson. Okay, anything else?
Nope.
Who wants to pray? Okay.
Lord, thank you so much for giving us this understanding. You always do, using Eric to help us to understand what it is you're saying to us, and mostly how much you love us, Lord, and your promise, never to let us go. Just, we needed to be reminded of that. We need to think about it, and as J. Vernon McGee says, chew on your word and chew the cud and really bring it into our heart and our spirit that you are with us and that you do love us and that you're not letting us go. So we thank you for this time. We ask you to help us this week with our struggles, and we ask you to bless us, Father, in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen.
Can I just add